if you have a family business with a valuation in the billions of dollars, but a family that would never sell it, okay, well, what's actually happening under the hood? Do we see family-owned businesses making the same kind of choices that a private equity-owned business would make? Usually not.
Welcome to System Catalyst, the show that cracks the code for making the world a better place. I'm your host, English Saul. Today, I am joined by Bridget Kustin, a senior research fellow at Said Business School at Oxford University and director of Ownership Project 2.0. Ownership Project 2.0 is a global research initiative that studies how ultra-wealthy individuals, family offices, and business-owning families think about ownership, wealth, impact, and responsibility. In this conversation, we'll explore how private capital shapes impact, philanthropy, and systems change. Bridget, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks so much, English. It's great to be here.
So, Bridget, I know that we've talked about this before, but when I was choosing what to go to grad school in, it was literally anthropology or industrial and organizational psychology. And I tipped into IO psychology, but in the back of my mind, I'm still like, should I go back for anthropology? Should I do another doctorate? Because it is such a fascinating topic to me. And I would love to hear first what inspired you to get into that role, that industry, and then how you think being an anthropologist is shaping your work on Project 2.0.
So I used to work for the US government in a small little commission that was a bit of a backwater, but it gave me a view into how strange government was. And I was 22 or 23, and when you're that young, you think that there are rules, you think the world works as you have been taught. And I was very quickly learning that none of that was true. It was really chaotic. And so to make a very long story short, I wanted a degree that would allow me to study the strangeness, right? This gap between what my expectations were versus what the world actually looked like. Before that, I thought I was going to study comparative literature and maybe political science. But instead, this realization that the world is not what I thought it was, it's a lot stranger and a lot more interesting, became the preoccupation. And so that's what led me to anthropology. And it's now central to what I do in terms of studying wealth holders. And I'm really faithful to the method. And that's because most of the research that is on elites tends to either come from a place of criticism, usually regarding wealth inequality. So we study elites in order to know how they're contributing to a set of problems. Or research on elites comes from the business world, which tends to be infused with a sense of praise or even flattery. We study elites because we think that being successful is amazing. Or more personally, I'm going to study elites in an overly positive way because I personally want to get a job consulting for them, or I want a seat on their board, or I'm hoping for some cut, right? I'm hoping to fundraise for my next project. And in between these two approaches that are either extremely critical or extremely positive is this yawning gap of lack of comprehension of what that world is in and of itself, not what it is and what that then means. And so as an anthropologist, I go in wanting to know what are the logics that make sense in that world. And I expect that they won't make sense in the civilian world, right? That's what we know when we study communities, is that they become insular because certain beliefs, ideas make sense to the people in that community, but are often perceived of as quite strange for outsiders. And so I find that approach has been really generative, lots of new insights. And the big surprise for me has been that wealth holders have been open to it as well. They too understand their world is strange. I thought they would find it off-putting to be studied like a lab rat, but the response I usually get is, of course we should be studied. This is the weirdest world. I have so much to say on that topic. Let me know when we can have a chat. That tends to be the response.
I think it's very true. And I think that, as we look at, even just your research, because I think before you were studying wealth holders, it was almost like you were studying the opposite. You were studying, marginalized populations who didn't have access to a lot of wealth, right? And so I'm curious how even maybe your study of non-elites led you to want to study more elites and what the impact of wealth is.
For sure. So I said I thought I might do comparative literature. So I spent my 20s learning Bengali. It's a language with a long poetic tradition, and I found it really meaningful to study Bengali poetry, not in translation. And with that Bengali fluency, when I started grad school, I came up with a research project that was in Bangladesh, which is a country I had spent years in by that point. And so I ended up pivoting from literature to household financial management. And so I lived in Bangladesh for a couple years on the border with Burma and the capital of Dhaka, and a couple months in Pakistan as well, and was studying household financial management, how families negotiate their kin relationships, extended kin relationships, in light of their debt relationships with an Islamic microfinance provider. And, a lot about academia involves some element of serendipity. And so as I was finishing my dissertation, I saw a job in London. I saw a job posting for a postdoc at the University of Oxford for a research project that was asking really similar questions as the ones that I had been studying, but on the opposite end of the spectrum. It was looking at family-owned businesses with revenue above $1 billion a year. And so I thought, really practically speaking, this is a fit. Now, once I started in the post and I understood how little data there was, how biased a lot of that data was, how much it focuses on smaller family businesses or country-only samples, like there's a lot on Spanish family businesses, there's a lot on South Korean family businesses. You don't always get globally representative data, or you only get data if you're looking at the big companies at the publicly listed ones. But the privately held family-owned businesses with revenue above $1 billion a year, black box, right? No one knows because they don't have to disclose. And so at this point, all the intellectual antenna are up and getting excited because there's just a lot that one doesn't know. I was familiar with the questions. And then the really exciting thing was the utility of the method, because in anthropology, you're meant to be a fly on the wall. And where anthropology was really helpful, having just studied the very poor in situations of tremendous financial deprivation and the forms of suffering that come from that, the method allowed me to be inured to the seductions of wealth. And what I mean by that is it continues to be physically easier to study wealth holders than to be in a extremely impoverished setting in Bangladesh. One might think I might want to start to get my piece, right? Maybe consultancy is the way to go. Maybe I should go into the private sector and see this as a route to improving my own financial circumstances. Fidelity to the method meant that wasn't the purpose and that wasn't the point. Now, of course, moving in both Bangladesh and among wealth holders is made easier by race, by class, by nationality, right? There's forms of privilege and access that are conditional on me having, or at least greatly eased by my own subject position, so that too plays a role. But I guess it doesn't sound particularly revolutionary, but in the course of doing this work, I meet a lot of people who are intimidated by billionaires, right? Or they come in with an agenda, but to simply approach them as people, as I did with the individuals in Bangladesh, is novel. And indeed, I'm told not infrequently by wealth holders that I'm the only person they've met in a while who doesn't want their money, or that doesn't want something from them beyond their opinion. That too is an important observation, that they tend to live in a world where there's always an ask.
Yeah. I've heard similar things, right? So what kind of research have you actually conducted on family businesses? And tell us a little bit about what you found and what you can share.
Sure. So two distinct pieces of research, one on family businesses and then one on family wealth and family offices. On the business side, there were two streams. One was quantitative and one was qualitative. The quantitative research, if you Google Peter Tufano and Belen Villalonga and Boya Wang and Journal of Corporate Finance. You can find the article that they wrote, which was an assessment of 3,000 listed companies with different ownership types: family-owned, private equity-owned, institutionally owned, government-owned. And they looked at their ESG performance using all of the major ESG data providers. And they also accounted for all of the factors that you would expect them to account for. And they ran the results several times, and their findings were robust. They found that family businesses underperformed on E, S, and G, environmental and social responsibility and governance. Yeah. The exception to this was family-owned businesses that had their name, their family name, as the title of the company, or family-owned businesses that still had a family member in a leadership role. Basically, it matters if the family still has that direct operational or reputational exposure. And one of the reasons that this is so interesting is that if you are a professional services advisor advising a major family-owned business, one of the common pieces of wisdom is that the best practice is to remove the family from direct ownership. That's seen as a way to mitigate nepotism, to ensure professionalism. But what our data suggests is that it also leads to underperformance on environmental, social, and governance issues, which is really interesting.
It's fascinating.
And then the other implication of it, of course, is that when I meet family businesses, they tend to think that they are the best kind of business in terms of being responsible and community oriented. And this data, focusing only on listed businesses, of course, suggests otherwise. Right? It has some pretty big caveats there. So that's the quantitative side. And then on the qualitative side, which is that was based on a series of interviews of 64 family principals that myself and a colleague conducted. Average revenue of their businesses was 11 billion, and number of papers that are still in process and are under consideration coming from that data. Wow. That has to do with organization within the family ownership unit. Basically, what's the body politic? Is the family an autocracy, bureaucracy, or democracy? Another paper looks at the ethical implications of family owners and whether or not they place more emphasis on founding goals. So a sort of founding goals or on future goals that are not yet realized. So founding DNA versus future goals. And that plays into very old debates about what's called a sort of epistemological approaches to what counts as ethics, really. And a couple other papers as well that are in progress. The best place to find all the research is on our website, where everything is listed. We also have a number of practitioner-facing outputs, not just academic journal articles, to make this intelligible to people actually doing the work at their family businesses.
And we'll make sure to link that in the show notes too, just the links to the website and to some of these articles. So you've touched on this a little bit, but can you give a little bit more detail about kind of the connection also between kind of like the understanding and the role of family businesses and how this plays into philanthropy and social impact in general?
So the great trick of capitalism in the past 30, 40 years, aided in large part by the works of business schools, is to convince the world that managerial capitalism is the most efficient, right? That is how you make the most profits. That is how you streamline your operations. And with managerial capitalism being held up as the best kind of capitalism, there's been this kind of magical disappearance of family businesses because they are not managerial, right? They are kinship driven with forms of messiness and emotion and non-logical goals that aren't always about the maximization of profit. Sometimes they're about the maximization of what is called socio-emotional wealth, right? Or the family's own emotional well-being or their goals for how they want to show up in society. And so there's always been this really interesting tension where there's this idea of what good capitalism is meant to look like. And then there are family businesses who don't always adhere and who do things their own way, but often still to like massive success, right? It doesn't always mean that they're financially underperforming or that they don't endure. Most of the families in our research on family businesses were beyond fourth generation, right? And again, minimum annual revenue of $1 billion. Average revenue was 11 billion. So big, old, successful businesses. So with managerial capitalism held up as the ideal of efficiency and profit generation, family businesses disappeared from public sight, but they never went away. The vast majority of businesses globally are small and medium family-run enterprises. You have hugely successful multi-generational family businesses across the globe, huge concentration of them in the US. So then there's this question of what do we do with the fact that there have always been family-run businesses? They continue to remain a bedrock of the global economy, and there are some extremely successful ones. One of the questions that I find most interesting to zoom out and look at the public discourse around discomfort with intergenerational privately held wealth, right? I'm not talking new money. I'm not talking IPOs or tech money. I'm talking about intergenerational family wealth from family businesses. Is what's the threshold after which it starts to become a problem? And the reason why that is such a thorny question and it is not one that lends itself to memes or to sound bites. And that's because for a lot of these families, the business is a family member. They talk about it as such in ways that anthropologically I find fascinating, right? It's basically an animate flesh and blood family member, often loved above others, right? So it's almost a cliche that a founder will love it more than their children. This burdens the children. This influences family dynamics, right? So the family business attachment is real. And what that means is that if you have a family business with a valuation in the billions of dollars, but a family that would never sell it, right? Okay, I get, yes, they are billionaires on paper and they get attendant social capital and political capital that comes with that standing, but that's not cash in the bank, right? And this is a point that gets lost. And here's where it then matters. Okay, well, what's actually happening under the hood, right? Do we see family-owned businesses making the same kind of choices that a private equity-owned business would make? Usually not, right? If we assume that multi-generational owners want to keep on owning for the long term, then there isn't a 10-year sell-off time horizon. They don't want to squeeze what they can and over-leverage the business. It's a sort of the assumption with very large family businesses is that they tend to carry very little debt.
Yeah.
Right? Because families tend to be risk averse. This makes them slightly more resilient or dramatically more resilient in downturns. So one of the things that is interesting is the vast gulf between these facts, which family businesses know to be true, and the general public's non-awareness of them.
Well, and my interest is, like, at the end of the day, what I hope to help move is more capital being put into systems change efforts. And I think what's really important is the research that you're doing on what it means to actually have a family business, what it means to operate in these different echelons, and then what that means for actually letting go of actual capital and putting it into something that is a systemic or a systems change effort.
So one of the surprises across the research looking at both family businesses and family offices has been how one of the surprises for me is the inconsistency around philanthropy. I would have assumed that at this level of wealth, and our median family office that I interview is, I think, $2.2 billion in assets under management. So I would have assumed at that level and at the level of an operating business with $1 billion plus in annual revenue, that there would have always been a family foundation with a strategy and a set of goals, and they're working to achieve them. And that's often not the case, right? There's a lot of ad hoc philanthropy. There's family members who do whatever they want. I would say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm going to say that it's a minority of those families over the past 8 years that I've engaged with who have a strategy to their philanthropic giving. For a lot more, it's quite scattershot and inconsistent. And also, and I say this respectfully, but it's also a lot smaller than I would have expected. Right. And I say that coming from the world in grad school of studying Islamic finance, right? Where in the world of Islamic charity and even Christian tithing, 10% of pre-tax income is considered, right, the minimum.
Yeah.
And so coming from that world of Islamic finance, annual 10% of giving pre-tax income is nowhere near, is much, much higher than the numbers that get quoted to me in interviews or that I look up on my own after an interview and see what's publicly disclosed. Now, maybe there's a lot happening that's private and not publicly disclosed, but I suspect not, because if it was, wouldn't they want to brag about it in an interview that tends to be focused on impact and public impact? So psychology has actually produced a great body of literature that consistently is showing versions of the result that the wealthier people are, the less generous they become. And one of my favorite studies looked at wealth in a comparative perspective in a really basic way. It looked at the length of time that cars stopped at a stop sign in the US, and it assessed the cars on how junky or how fancy they were. And they found really robustly that the junky cars always stopped for longer and the fancier cars consistently stopped less. So, data point number one, looking at wealth or elite status in that comparative perspective already suggests that there is a willingness to adhere more to social norms and rules. And we can then analyze why that might be, right? Maybe you can't risk an arrest, or you don't have money for a ticket. You're not above the law squarely applies to you. There's also a lot of research in my area, or my previous area, studying the poor and specifically microfinance, which is that the reason why people are often so generous at lower levels of wealth is because they have to be. You rely on your neighbors to survive. You must be generous toward them because you will need their generosity reciprocated to help yourself out, right? I will watch your kids now because I know I'm going to need you to watch my kids when I'm at work. Yes, you can borrow this food from me now because when I have a cash flow shortage next month, I'll need to borrow my food from you. So there's this survival element that creates human generosity, and that gets lost once people do not need to rely on humans to survive in the same way. However, stepping back and taking that systems lens, of course we rely on humans to survive. Anyone who is a parent, as you and I both are, will probably encounter that really wild sensation where your kids start school after you're extremely kind of protected, nurturing them as babies and toddlers, and then suddenly you realize, oh my God, other parents' parenting choices and how supported a kid is at home or not, whether that kid is being given enough to eat, whether that kid is, God forbid, being abused, that becomes my problem because that kid brings that to school and then bullies my kid or abuses my kid, or they do to my kid or say to my kid what they've heard at home, right? So we are absolutely enmeshed with each other. And this is why a lot of my informal questions as I get to know wealth holders, which, to be fair, can often come across as maybe a little too overly familiar, has to do with like, well, is your kid in private school or public school? Do you take public transit? Do you go to public parks? Do you ever fly coach, right? Like, are there moments when you have to experience that give and take of community in a really direct way? And for some wealth holders, the answer is intentionally yes, right? They do it on purpose in order to raise kids who remain a part of the world. And then for some wealth holders, the answer is intentionally no, I don't want to do those things. And then there's a fascinating line of questioning that simply starts with, oh, why is that?
Yeah.
Right? So rather than jumping to the idea of, oh, that means you're selfish. Oh, that means you're anti-community, right? We don't know that if someone says that their kid is in private school and they only fly private and they, create high walls around their life experience. We don't know why, right? So the answer then is why? What's behind that? And that's where another layer of interesting, often quite psychological, personal beliefs, sensitivities, fears, desires take root.
The work of systems change, right, is we've had a lot of amazing people on this podcast who are sort of really at the front lines of the system of which they are working to change. And I think one of the things that's imperative is the funding of this work.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a lot of intention. There's a lot of really wonderful intention out there that I see of trying to fund this systems change work. But in a lot of ways, it has to be an active decision to say, I will fund the change in the system that maybe has benefited me, or of one that I am not familiar or don't have sort of a negative relationship with. And I guess I just wonder how or if that has come up in your work at all, and your perspective on that, of that intention, right?
Yeah. So here is a surprise for me, is how well intentioned most of the people I meet are. To be honest with you, English, I was not expecting that. When I started, I was expecting, sociopath central, right? Because I came to the world of wealth holders as a civilian, right? Like having watched the movies and read the books, and there's this voyeuristic gaze, and right. So I'm expecting something pretty negative. And I was shocked at how literally every person I met, except for probably one, is deeply, deeply wanting to do good and to be a good person, and will often ask me at a certain point, quite like humbly even, like, what have you seen? What have I found? Any ideas? Like any hot takes on what I should be doing differently? And, at this point, I fumble a bit because my job is to ask the questions and to just document and take in. So that was a surprise, is how good the intentions are.
Ooh.
So then the question is, okay, if largely there's the intention bit sorted, then why isn't the money moving, right? Like, this is your point. Why isn't the capital moving? And a couple things that come up time and time again. One is a profound, deep, from birth, fear of failure. So in the context of family businesses, where the mantra goes shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, the idea that family businesses are doomed to fail after 3 generations, which has a pretty shaky empirical base, but the saying endures across a number of cultures and languages. You're told that failure is imminent. And so to be the person that makes that curse come true is a pretty terrifying thing to have to live under. Now, that's specific to the business, right? But if you're talking about systems change, which is a big lift requiring vision and confidence and long-term planning and the allocation of capital, it stands to reason that aversion to failure in one sphere, ownership of the family business, is going to extend to other spheres, right? Like systems change. So there's the fear of failure. Related to the fear of failure is a very complicated relationship to risk. And the reason it's complicated is that widening our aperture beyond family businesses and looking to family offices and also entrepreneurs, people who've had those IPOs, had those divorce settlements, had those liquidity events. Relationships to risk are rarely rational. They're deeply personal. And how you come into the money matters deeply. Whether it's an IPO or a divorce, there can be a sense of, I didn't fully make it, so it's not mine to play fast and loose with. And for people who did make the money or are the entrepreneur or have inherited the wealth, there can also be a sense of profound loss aversion, right? I've spent my whole life building something up. I'm not going to gamble it away, right, on an impact venture or on a systems change venture. And so, with that in mind, like, so much of the social discourse targeting billionaires is kind of hitting them over the head with a hammer, saying they're bad people. And the reason why I find that to be interesting is because I actually don't think that their goodness or badness is the problem, right? I see goodness. It's been pretty consistent. I think the issue is fear of failure and loss aversion, right? So then the question is, how can we build up forms of legacy or narrative or storytelling that allow people to craft the why or the story of what they're doing in such a way that they can claim a success, even if it doesn't fully eliminate the problem they're trying to solve, or do so within their lifetime, right? But they can still have a way to feel good about themselves and to address these deep-seated fears. So, I think some of the kind of go-to means of exerting pressure on wealth holders aren't really hitting the right notes.
So I'm curious, for listeners who want to create systemic change, what might be some advice you have for those listeners as they go forward and aim to be in relationship across the board with, just other people who might have more access to the tool of wealth?
Sure. So years ago, I abandoned the academics' preferred point of view, which is that we hold the answers. And I realized that peer learning for wealth holders will always come first and is more powerful than anything I might have to say coming from a data-backed perspective. And that's because, to be fair, there's such specificity to the experience and so many variables and just kind of personal, friend sort of advice and coaching. And that's not what I'm here to provide. So I would actually recommend that everyone seek out Mrs. Tsitsi Masiyiwa and Sir Christopher Hone and ask them about the End Fund, which I stand in awe of. They are on the path to eliminating 8 neglected tropical diseases. And it is the definition of systems change. It is the definition of bravery, because the path to eliminating these 8 neglected tropical diseases means that you don't have a single success or failure. You have incremental wins, but then challenges along the way. It requires partnerships with pharma, with government, and with other wealth holders. And the other thing that I think is really exciting about this is that, what I've observed from a distance is that somehow they've managed to make everyone involved feel important and feel special. Because the other thing, going back to your other question of why isn't the capital moving, let me give a healthy challenge to your listeners, right? If you are among the richest in your state, region, nation, or the world, your ego is pretty big, right? Even if you kind of wish it weren't, right? Like, it probably is. And people often want to take credit for solving something big themselves. You can't impact systems alone. You have to do it in partnership. The task is too big. There's only so many hours in the day, and there's only so much money you are willing to give. And so the other thing that I think is so beautiful about this project is that it shows that no one could do it alone, right? They all need each other.
I just want to emphasize with our listeners, I promise I did not tell Bridget to say End Fund, but I am so happy that you did. I sat on the board of End Fund for a little while, and we've interviewed Tsitsi and Ellen, Tsitsi Maswi and Ellen Agler on this podcast. So I'm going to put a link to their episodes in this chat. But I couldn't agree with you more. And there are, at least from my perspective, there are other things that are occurring like that. And,
yes.
and I have to say that my dear friend and co-founder of this podcast, Jeff Walker, always says too, like, it's about contribution, not attribution. And working alongside people is just joyful. Like, it's just wonderful, nice work to work with people who come into a situation, are able to bring the resources that they can and say, let's all work towards an aligned goal. And there's something really joyful about coming together with an effort towards a systems change project. One of the things we do on this podcast, you know, as we're coming to a close, is ask our guest, what is a question or a thought that you want to leave our listeners with?
The question that I would like your listeners to consider is, surely they've come across a wealth holder leading a project that they admire, they find transformative, and they find exciting. What is stopping you from getting a hold of that person and asking to put some of your philanthropic capital into that pot and to join up with them? Because if you like what they're doing and you admire it, ask yourself what's stopping you from taking that next step of exploring the offer to move your capital to what they're doing. That would be the question that I would leave listeners with. Because as you said, there are lots of very compelling examples out there, and lots of good work is happening, often quietly, right? And listeners will probably have an idea of what some of those projects are. So yeah, let's think about those individual blockages and then let me know so I can interview you and document them.
Yeah.
Anonymously, of course.
Exactly. Bridget, thank you so much. I just have to say, I'm personally very fascinated by your work. The researcher in me, the psychologist and want to be anthropologist inside of me is just constantly excited whenever you guys put out new information and new research. So thank you for coming on this podcast and talking about it. And I think that this conversation is going to be really helpful to a lot of our listeners. So thank you.
Well, the admiration and respect is mutual, and I'm grateful that your listeners have you guiding them through the topic. So more to come. Thanks so much, English.